Molweni, Dumelang, Sambonani, and welcome to the AVRIC podcast, a podcast that aims to bring clarity to the concept of violence and its consequences in the lives of victims and survivor groups, as well as the perpetrators and their descendants.
In this episode, Professor Kopano Ratele and Dr. Sophia Sanan explore the intricate relationships between African art, Black subjectivity, and African psychology. They explore the challenges posed by racialized structures of aesthetic and identity theories within South Africa's colonial legacy. Furthermore, they offer profound insights into how education and creativity can foster a deeper understanding of African identities and advocate for a more inclusive and decolonized approach to art and psychology.
Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming here today to listen to us. So I think this started as a discussion outside of the seminar room about art and psychology. And I think that the question that sort of came up for both of us was around the notion of African art and the notion of African psychology, and what is at stake in the definition of those terms, and very particularly from the location of Stellenbosch University and the town of Stellenbosch. So my question to start things off, and you may expand on this or go in other directions, Kopano, but the question, I guess, is around what is African psychology and what are some of the stakes and politics implied in that category? What are you saying about how we conceive of subjectivity when you talk about African psychology in Africa? And what are the contestations around epistemology that are implicit here about ways of knowing and the languages that we have to articulate this knowing? I think that this is kind of the basis from which I'd want to then also think with you about African art and ways of knowing and ways of seeing.
Thank you, Sophia. So can I just also make remarks about how this came about? So when I learned that Sophia had done work and PhD in the history of African art, particularly Zico, you might say more about that. I said, that's great, because I've been looking for somebody like this. So that was the good part just after one of was it the last one? One before that, here at AVRIC. Because I've been thinking quite a lot about African psychology and its relationship with other studies of Africa. So African studies, African politics, African history, African philosophy, and African art. So that's the connection. That's one connection. And then we started about this category, which I will ask you about, African art. And then, of course, I Googled you. Just see what kind of work you have done. Okay, so that's the part of why we get to be here. Because I have been spending quite a lot of time, particularly since about 2015, so it's about 9-10 years right now, thinking about African psychology. And I should just give, another backstory to this. For about a decade and a half, I ran away from psychology because it didn't make sense to me. Some things. I felt like I was channeling Europe quite a lot when I teach. Still feel like that sometimes when I teach undergraduate, like I'm channeling Europe. But after a while, I said, something happened in my head about how to think, which goes to the question you asked, about how to think about African psychology. And so when I returned, when I decided to return to teaching in particular, which I will say something about, I wanted to come back to teaching undergrads. And Lou Marie is here, who invited me, one of the people who invited me to come back to a teaching university, or at least a residential university. So let me start by asking my own questions, because I have a few things I wanted to get through, because there's a lot of confusion and misunderstandings about, at least as far as I'm concerned, about African psychology. So here's a question that I have occupied myself with over the last, about to be 3 years now, 2.5 years. But as I said, this starts about 2015, and I can say why that is. So how do you teach with love? That's an important word right there. It's a Martin Luther King word. That's where I get it from the book, Where Do You Go From Here? and a speech that you might know. How do you teach with love in a lecture hall in which the majority of students are white, young people, about the radical potential of an African psychology, that it has a radical potential for them too, because at the center of this are black students for me, right? I come to Stellenbosch, I want them to see someone like me, and so that was a part of it. But I come to university to make myself uncomfortable. Don't know whether it was a good idea, but I'm here now. Okay, let me put it in a different way, right? I've put it in a different way. So how do you inculcate in students in the best possible way this simple idea that Stellenbosch is on an African continent? It's like really a simple idea. That it's in South Africa and it's not a département, and I don't know how to say this in French, a département of an imaginary European country. Sometimes one walks the streets and you still think like, this is, what a bubble this is. So, and by asking this and by trying to inculcate this in students, I want them to fully digest and work through the colonial and racist history. And Jewel was here last week and says 2 weeks ago or so, something really about this, like how do you live with this knowledge that your people enslaved others, that you have benefited from this history, and that this history constitutes you. So it constitutes subjectivity, it constitutes yourself and this place. So you still have farms, as you know, where they sell really nice food, but there are graves there. So unlearning the view of Africa and those defined as African or black, and as you know, Achille Mbembe says, the Subi Africans to be black, and that's already right there. It's a psychology of a black experience as well. And that means also respectively a place for people who were thought to be less than human, right? And so unlearn your own superiority complexes when you're in class, of being European or being white, more human. So over the last 3 years, quickly, I've taught these classes and trying to do this, try to teach African psychology. And quickly, in the first year, I won an award about this. And that this year I learned that, no, actually, most students don't think African psychology, well, they're confused about it. And I see one of our assistants there, they say, for a whole lot of reasons. So it just diluted my happiness. But no, I thought they were just getting it. But no, actually, only a few of those who selected me. Okay, so that's basically about coming here, trying to teach psychology in an uncomfortable place, in a bubble, so students can unlearn this thing. So let me say how I understand. So quickly, just to define it. There are a number of ways to define African psychology. Even my best interlocutors, every time I say African psychology, what I hear is they're thinking sangomas. They're thinking goats, slaughter. They're thinking traditional healing practices. And so there's one way to define African psychology. And a guy like Augustin Noye, who I've been exchanging this for a long time, defines it this way, that African psychology is the systematic and informed study of the complexities of human mental life, culture, and experience in the pre- and post-colonial African world. So my flight from psychology was precisely this. I couldn't quite relate to some things about that. So it's a study of objects, quote unquote, in Africa. That will include traditional healing, pre-colonial. And then only later I start to realize that what they're talking about is what I would term then cultural African psychology. They're talking about a cultural psychology, a culture psychology, a folk psychology, an ethno-psychology. These debates have been happening in philosophy for a while, right? Ethno-philosophy, Placide Temples did that, Bantu kind of psychology. But no, this is all well and good. But it tends to then stultify, restrict identities for me. It tends to make us only or mostly cultural subjects. But if you, like many of you, if you travel across Africa but also travel around the world, you start to see things that have less to do with culture and more to do with other things. Migration doesn't have anything to do with culture. Migration of African young men and African people into Europe has to do with the economy, right? With governance, and that's what I mean by that word critical. I mean a material kind of psychology. Psychology that says there's a relationship between mental health and poverty. That's it. It has little to do with culture as such. But that, I'm not dismissing it entirely because it's part of my framework. So while you're thinking about the cultural object, beliefs, and things that are called culture, you must also think about materiality. Materiality, the economy, poverty, migration, and all of these are part of psychology. And then, because this thing called African psychology is in somewhere between African studies and psychology, in between but also encompasses this, right? It sits. So there's an African studies of Africa on one side and studies of psychology. And so it sits between but also encompasses that. When I go to, last December, I was in San Francisco talking about Afrofuturism, for instance. So it also has to talk to people who are doing that work, whether they're filmmakers or artists. So it includes that as well. But the majority of people at Stellenbosch, which is my last point, and in South Africa, even in African countries, I was in Addis about a month ago, still do what I call Western-oriented African psychology. So they're teaching Freud here as though, they're teaching all kinds of stuff. So in one sense, what our students tend to learn mostly is to think about the world as though they're not here, that they're elsewhere in their imagination. And that's a sad part about it. So that's where I would start. And for you, of course, I have something where I started about, which we've been talking about. So as soon as we started, you say, well, the category of African art is a problem, or not a problem. Sometimes it's a problem, sometimes it works, sometimes. And I wanted to talk about African art as a category. Maybe you can make connections with subjectivity, if you will. When is it galvanized? Should be galvanized. When is it downplayed? And what is at stake? And I know you might talk about something called Global South. I want you to talk about that. Sometimes I say, yes, Global South, but yeah, please, say more.
Okay, thanks, Kopano. I think that just kind of locating it also in this context of Stellenbosch and, why I think about invoking this or kind of calling into question this frame of reference. And you talked about ideas of superiority and sort of maybe unlearning superiority. And I think that's where art and psychology meet each other through language. Because I think the issue that we've discussed around art is not the making itself. It's not the things, it's not the act of creating art. That I think is making art is something that humans have always done. And in fact, recently, the artifacts found in Blombos cave date back to 70,000 years ago, so some 20,000 more than they first thought were the very first instances of sort of creative production here in South Africa. But I think it's about the language and the framing, and it's about the contextualization. So as you point out, my response immediately when you said, "Oh, you've studied African art," and I said, "There's a problem with African art." The problem with African art is that the very term the term itself talks about a problem, because we don't talk about European art in the same way. So the crux is about the universality or the particularity. And these are really not new kind of revolutionary arguments. People have been making these points for very long. And I think that someone like Valentin Mudimbe put it really beautifully in the 1980s when he said that the very term African art emerges from a Western epistemic project of order and categorization rather than a cross-cultural engagement with aesthetics, histories, and epistemologies. So he asked, what would have actually happened if understood in their initial form and significance, the objects that found their way across the oceans, after these first waves of colonization, where various objects were taken and placed into European museums, what would have happened if there was a different language to understand them? Would they not have had a radical impact? And I think the idea that there is a radical epistemological potential in African art, in that which has been systematically evacuated by dominant knowledge economies, in the sense that the ways in which kind of dominant framings of art history have always found language to place African art in some kind of time frame where it is a precursor, where it is something that has come before, it talks about a time that other civilizations have already passed. That when you really think about what African art, and as far back as it reaches, it has a radical potential to overturn those spurious arguments completely, were it to be understood in different terms and different words. And I think that, there are various kind of thinkers who have looked at different moments of African art, say, for example, modernist art, and made very convincing arguments that speak against this idea that art from Africa always emerges as from an encounter with Europe. This idea that actually things have been going on, civilizations have been epistemologies, ways of seeing the world, traditions of art that not only long predate the colonial encounter, but that are also not always as a response to the colonial. And I think that historically museums have played a very strong role in maintaining these kind of false premises, this idea that we still see in museums, these kind of, that idea of incarcerated objects that we've also talked about, which is also very much at the heart of this very strong movement around restitution of objects, that it's not just about returning African objects to Africa, but it is about returning or reclaiming the frames of reference for how these cultures are understood and how they are understood to be in conversation with the present. So that whole sort of idea of the idea of return as precipitating a new relational ethics, that it's not that we don't want to perpetuate a situation where we accept as normal an art, a way of understanding and appreciating art, the terms of which have been set historically as objects on plinths displayed in certain ways, ocular-centric, certain languages and terms to describe them that tell you nothing about what they're really, the life worlds from which they come. So I think in that way, because it's so burdened in that sense, there are very strong arguments against not using this word African art and just saying it's art. Very strong arguments against, for example, the idea of the African pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which attempts to represent an entire continent. And that's where this term, this sort of problematic idea of the global south maybe comes in, is that in response to these various kind of interpolations and these baggages that these terms carry of Asian art or African art, there's a sort of temptation to invest more in, say, a term like global south. And I think that comes very strongly from a position exacerbated by what is going on with the genocide in Gaza, that there's a sense that the Western world, that there's a need to counter it. There's a need to counter the ethics or the moral bankruptcy that we see in the supposed sort of universal thinking order that's been represented by that Western world. So I think that it's sort of, as you suggest, it really comes with its own problems, but there is, there's almost, I think, in contemporary art, a temptation or desire to invest in a concept like that. And yet we sit with this question in Stellenbosch, thinking, is it too soon to try to distance from the idea of African art? Is there not much more that can be done and that can be thought through and that can be made possible if we that idea of an African aesthetics? So I think that's what those two sort of hold, that it holds all of these baggages and these problems, but what do we do with it here and now?
You can feel contradictory questions in my head about this. So there are moments when the category of African art, are you saying that you are saying there are moments, even in all this problematic, that this problem of, the story about Picasso, of course, about what do you call this? Demoiselle d'Avignon, that work that takes the mask, and then one of the figures there is a mask. Even though the category is galvanized, or is not galvanized, but it's spoken of, uttered in relation to Europe. And so there's problems around that. And so you'd have Global South as a replacement of African art. I don't know about some of you, but there are moments when or now much more, I completely identify with the category of African. Well, there's all this complexity, especially in South Africa, that I am identifying with it. So I'm always, and I tease, some of them I speak to, I tease my colleagues that, so you are not African? Who are lighter skinned. So you're not African? So I like this category. I moments like that. But of course there are moments where I know how it is being used. I can hear how it's being used. I mentioned the goats and the sangomas, and like that's all we are. So we're tribals basically. Right? So there are moments like that. And there are moments when I have problems in how Spotify gets its lineup, its playlist. But I can see its uses even in that context. So what are you saying about that? Particularly in a place like Stellenbosch.
So I think in a place like...
And the museum, by the way.
And the museum. Okay. So I think that in a place like Stellenbosch, I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday, where's it, Juma? this idea that, a town, it's a place like Stellenbosch, and let's be sort of broader, even the Western Cape, that what is it that about Cape Town that a German visitor might feel more at home than someone visiting from Cameroon, say, and not in a sort of superficial sense of Africanization. I'm thinking of the time around 2010 when where there was like the World Cup, and then there was a World Design Capital, and there was actually a very strong sort of state investment in really trying to Africanize, in a visual sense, the city, and but when you kind of look at what's happened to that project, and you think of where we are today in terms of the visual cultures, in terms of the investments of symbols that kind of talk about particular identities in a place like Stellenbosch, where the heritage of white culture is so strong and visible. I think that we are far from a point where we can say, well, the African thing, it's too burdened, we need to move on to other more hybrid identities. I think that there's a very clear need to really think about African aesthetics, African histories, and to centralize them. But I think that's a very, it's a very tricky thing, especially when it comes to art and visuality, that it can so easily be done in such a superficial way. So that's where I think the language becomes important, because what are, like we've said, it's not about the things themselves. The art is being made. It will always be around, but it's about how we frame it, how we understand it. Where does it fit into a typology? And I think that, in South Africa, there is a lot of curatorial work that centralizes black art histories, that has been really important in reframing kind of discourse within the, art historical discourse. Black modernists, really important retrospectives that have looked at black South African artists, women artists, and so on.
At the Novel, yes.
At the Novel, the work that Zeitsmoker does, and so on. But this sort of happens at a very high art level, And I think that when we talked about it last, that idea of kind of what it means as a social and a cultural project, we talked about Thabo Mbeki's I'm an African. And that idea in the late 90s, early 2000s of radically inclusive notion of African that he was really criticized for, which included white settlers.
Mm-hmm.
And he included also a view of Africa that long predates, and of South Africa that long predates the colonial encounter, but also includes it, and includes the scars and the wounds of that violent time and its aftermath and its present, as that this is Africa. And somehow I feel like that project, which I think has, my question to you would also be, where does that project stand today as a political project, as an institutional project? I think that there's something there to revisit, in my view. And I think, if I may, I wanted to ask you, since you're also involved in the university at a kind of institutional level, where, if any, is there space to invite different ways of thinking or African ways of thinking and epistemologies into the workings of this institution? Especially if we think of recent events in the life of this institution and sort of political stances that are taken, where is the space to invite a different ethic?
I have a couple of answers for that. One is and Ronel is here, who's with me in this institutional work. Is anybody else? Of course, I see Wilhelm there doing it differently. That there are some things happening, not rapidly enough. And even when you're doing this work, and I will mention what kind of work, even if you're doing this work, then you saw how the minister criticized Stellenbosch that we're supporting genocide. But okay, yeah. But yes, you don't want to stand up and say, but some of us didn't do that, but we get defeated because we're part of this institution, right?
Yeah.
So even if you do other work, this other work I'm referring to is, for instance, there's a possibility that there will be a Center for Critical Race work here and cultural work. There's a possibility that next year we'll have that. So it's still a possibility because the rectorate is supportive of that. But even if they support that, on the other hand, they support. So that's like a weird thing. And person in this thing I'm part of is called. His mandate is to change institutional culture, Stellenbosch. So there's 5 of them. Ronel is on the student one, looking at Welgenhof for among other things, and student cultures. There's one on curriculum. There's one about how to talk, which I really like, how to talk about ourselves, by Pilam Semang, who's a philosopher. So it's called Race, Human Categorization and Science, about how Stellenbosch might learn to talk differently about people here, but also hopefully invite others to talk about that. And this is great work. And it'll inform our ethics. You remember 2019 when we had that problem about how to do that work. So there's work that's happening. And of course, Elmarie Costandi, as you might remember, was trying to do other kinds of work and public work, not just high art. So there's work happening. So that's one part of the answer, which is, one last event. As a matter of fact, in a few weeks, we're inviting another philosopher who's trying to Africanize institutional culture. That is thinking about that. Professor Metz at UG will be here. And then one short thing, and then a longer thing. One short thing is the thing about, well, maybe 2 things. One is we have to name things. Things have to be named. That's what the academy does. You give them names, you define them. And so that's the problem sometimes of evading a category like African. Sometimes yes, but we have to name things. And the naming is where we are sometimes. We have to name it. As I said, we named this thing called the Center for Critical Race and Cultural Studies instead of, for instance, Critical African Studies, for instance. But we have to name it. It must be named to be known. So that's one part. The second short part is this thing. The more you talk, the more I listen, the more I read. Is the education I didn't get is the relationship that I just gestured earlier on. If you're going to teach psychology in an African country, let me stick with psychology, you cannot not talk to other disciplines that study Africa. I mean, that's like a really clear thing in my head, that imagining Africa, even with the problems you have in history of African art, helps me to think, the people have had similar problems right here. So how might I think about this in the future? So let me say something quick. Could you, Caesar, I will show you which one is this. About, and this connects with Thabo Mbeki. Yes, that's it. That's it. The first time I saw this piece of work, a few years ago, I don't remember when it was acquired at Zico. What's happening here? I had to double back a little bit, and then I started reading and finding. This is the work by Johannes Pukela, who had a retrospective at the Zaitse last year, 2 years ago, no, during COVID. And he's doing, and there's a 14-minute documentary that you will see about that. It's not documentary, short. So he's doing something. For me, African psychology, if I was to define it, I would say it's a heuristic of thinking about the world from Africa, about the self, about the subject. It's a way of thinking. It's not only, and that way then encompasses these other ways, right? Cultural ways of thinking, material ways of thinking. And so the work of Pukela, for instance, I should say first that I'm amazing. The moment I realized how thinking through art, thinking via art, benefits thinking about psychology. So stuff that's not in psychology. I realized, and then I had to do this self-study, which is like a poor. I'm sorry, I'm not. It's really poor. And every time I see on the main road, or I'm plugging on the main road, there's a couple of young people, like not so young, who are doing quote-unquote African art next to Grotesque there. And I go and hang out with them. Wooden sculptures, fantastic work. Some of them are in our corridor. In town, just next door to the book lounge, there's Mamadou Diomande makes shoes, amazing shoes. What am I telling you? I'm telling you that there are absolutely amazing contemporary African artists who are making the art. They might call themselves African artists in different forms and art, right? And I have mentioned in another context Nasty C. He gives me a problem in my head, but it's like Johannes Pukela, right? Nasty C, Stembizo Sbisi's work is fantastic. I mean, died at young. Gregory Makoma, the performer. El Anutsui, somewhere in Nigeria. Tebe Makuku, the clothes are amazing. And you can name all of this art. And that guy called Francis Esua, Enfant Precoce, who practice in France. So there's a lot of these African artists. And they're learning me, I'm learning from them about how to see that. So this work can be made by African artists. This is also African art. Is this provocative enough? But this is made like, is this African art? Why isn't it if it's made by him? And he cites himself, says, well, you see, if we call me an African artist, and I met the exiles when he was in exile, and they found his art, what did he say? Politically unsound. I think he says, so the people in exile found my art politically unsound. But I like how unsettling, how provocative, and worthy of study what he's doing. He says, I'm an artist who comes from Africa, and I like this work. And the more you study, he says, what is he doing exactly? So he's expanding exactly this subjectivity, that of course you can make art wherever if you are in Bree Street, wherever you are, you can make not only the masks, you can make art like this. You can make playful, provocative art. You can change who is making the art. And in that moment, he's doing an Mbeki in one sense, from a different perspective. They're expanding that. And this last thing, before we end it, quick story. And this takes us, Africa also outside. Baldwin, in 1951, I think it was 51, Baldwin goes to a small village in Switzerland. James Baldwin, right? He's already famous. And he would write a short essay called Stranger in the Village. You know the essay? Highly recommend that essay. But how I come to the essay is through Teju Cole. Teju Cole, another writer, another essayist of incredible talent. So he writes about this, about how I was probably the first black person they've ever seen in this village. And the children ran around, called me nigger. And then he's telling about what happens in the village. And then the children are calling him nigger. So probably these children don't know what the word means to me, being from the US. But then he's flipping us. And then he says, but they have more relationship to the originals, like, or not Pokela's one, the original European art, than I have. Teju Cole says, hell no. I will have it all. I will have it all. That Baldwin, Teju Cole loves Baldwin, right? He says, Baldwin, who's already a famous artist, feels that he who has read this, who writes amazing, feels that he's excluded from global art, if you will. And global art that we know has been stolen, has been inspired by Africa. What he says, there was a certain restrictiveness about blackness in the 50s, but I will have it all. But also, I will not put African art as a precursor before that, because jazz or the blues is as good as classical music. And I like that. I like this idea that the problem here is even somebody like Baldwin doesn't know, might not understand what Mbeki is doing, that I will have it all. I will even have the people who have conquered me in this part of the African category. This is why I like Johannes Bukero.
I mean, I think, just in closing before we open up for questions, I think that idea of sort of making art and being human is like two sides, it's one and the same thing. And that's that when someone is forced to say, but we do make art, it's almost like having to say, but we are human.
Yes.
And I think that is the contention around why should the burden of proof have to lie with the majority, if we are in Africa, how absurd in a sense. But in another sense, in the case of Stellenbosch, or even not just Stellenbosch, but in a country like South Africa with its history, and it's not alone, it's not completely unique in this way. That idea of, as you say, have it all. What is the continuum?
Yeah.
That it is not a choice between, do you see your own cultural aesthetic history as reaching back to Europe and the ways in which the kind of conventional art history will place a civilizational narrative, or do you locate it here and say it includes all these things? It also includes these civilizations that predate colonialism. It includes, the Benin civilization.
Yes.
It includes Mapungubwe.
Right.
So I think that is the sort of the non-cheesy, it's been made so kind of superficial in a way, that idea of we're African and reaching back to, but I still think that there's a need for it, because it has been written out of history so powerfully. So there needs to be a powerful reinscribing of that history, that everybody who is here feels in some way connected to that it's not alien to anybody, that what's familiar and comfortable in an historical sense is not what is European, but it is what is here. And I think that is where there is work being done and more work to be done, to name and to display and to see and to think about these kind of lineages. So
I would add, not only to say to make art is to be human, right? To be human is to make art. To make knowledge is to be human. And so the weird thing about, at least from my department, is this idea that this implicit idea that we cannot make this thing called psychology, that we can just import it. That's it. To make knowledge is human. It's a vital part about this, and I really like this idea. So we're in a contradiction, and part of the answer is, so who are you talking to, really? Because sometimes when you use the category Africa is because you're talking to someone elsewhere. But of course, if you're talking to each other, we're talking about the topic, the discussion, the vocabulary also changes. And it looks like we're those people, some of us at Stellenbosch. So in one moment, we're talking, as it were, to others. In some moments, we have to talk to ourselves. And in that case, we don't use the language of Africa. And this is, so Africa is a strategic category. It's more than a strategic category. Okay. I see you're ready. Please. And you want to introduce yourself so that people know, and let's have a discussion then.
Thank you, Prof.
And you are hiding, so people can see you. Right here.
No, Caesar said I should stand that side.
Yeah, right here. Right here. Don't do that, yeah.
Right,
please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Bapio Koboto. I'm a PhD student here at the center. Thank you very much, Prof. and Sophia, for such a lovely presentation. My question was more around, I liked the questioning of this African psychology and this Africanization of it. It's a situatedness, putting it right. But my question is, how then, as young scholars, for example, myself, I work with masculinities, and sometimes we contend with this idea of hegemonic masculinity or African masculinity. And as I study more and more, I realize that when we speak about hegemonic masculinities, we tend to speak about a certain white masculinity, a dominant masculinity. But when we use the term African masculinities, we talk about a more traditional, more patriarchal, But now, for example, then, which is what I'm trying to grapple with, and especially theoretically, especially a young scholar, I struggle to understand how then, as young scholars, we must situate, especially, for example, if you're looking at township masculinities, because then you can't use technically African masculinities in that sense, because they're not as traditional as in your rural areas. So how do we then use this theoretically and trying to fight this box of hegemonic or African masculinities? I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, that's great. No, really, it's great. Thank you. So you're quite right. So this idea, for people who don't know, this idea of hegemonic masculinity comes into the world through the work of Raven Cornell and her students in Australia, so Global South. And then it doesn't take off, and then he publishes the work in the US, and then it takes off, right? So that's the first thing. But even in that book, in the two books the first book that does the gender power, she says something quite, and people tend to miss it, and Sakums in fact kind of mentions this. He says, in Western culture, and keeps on repeating this, here is the hegemonic masculinity in Western culture, even though Australia, and she says this, and she, the subordinated masculinity is Western culture, is queer masculinity, subordinated, right? And then mentions, and then what she calls marginalized, the black. So this category of black masculinity is almost outside of thinking about masculinities, right? And so over time, a number of us, including Sakums and Fekana, the anthropologist, and as I said, well, first of all, you have then to talk about different hegemonies, right? That's the first thing. So the hegemony in Langa or in townships, the hegemonic masculinity is different from the hegemonic masculinity in Australia. And Sakums is at pains to say the hegemonic masculinities is uninitiated and initiated. And that's a really good conceptual way. So not completely disputing or debating the category of the idea of hegemonic masculinity, but it looks different depending on where you are. And that's a good way to read it. But I like the question for a more global reason. And the reason is how to read Raven Cornell. That's the point. How do you read Raven Cornell? And the more I, as you might know, did a forward to my last book, is she's very open. She's aware about this, and her later work is thinking from the South, basically, right? Thinking about universities, about power, about coloniality from the South. So it's about we, when we think about masculinities, think from place. Don't think about theory as though it's a loaf of bread and you just slice it and make it nicer, but make a different bread. You have to think from place, and the more I'm thinking about it, and in your work I've seen that the kinds of things that go into making men in Langa or in Soweto are different from the way even some of us in this room are being made, right? If I'm made in a Constantia, the things that go into making me are different from. And so this reading from place is really important in thinking about theory and research and your own reading, and it's a practice. And this is really why I like this, thinking from place and disturbing and changing it. I hope that goes somewhere. We can have this discussion. We haven't had this discussion in a long time. Okay.
Yes, I had. Thank you so much for the discussion. I've just been taking nuggets of going back and forth. But the question that came to mind that was emerging as you were speaking about, as both of you were speaking about this idea of claiming cultural aesthetics across different landscapes and using different tools to do that. I can't help but think about, so if we're making different bread, what does the bakery look like?
I like that. Let's go on with this
let's
metaphor.
carry the metaphor
Let's go.
further. What is the is it a franchise? Do we want it to exist in the, you know what I mean? Do we want to sell African bread? Do we want to make it this product that goes out? Or is the bread meant to represent an uncomfortable nourishing process that is taking place not only in Stellenbosch, but in different, I think, town spaces that are contending with this similar tension, right? And so then the question that I have is, either in your personal capacity or in your work, what are the tools that you are leaning on? What are the tools that you are also creating for these younger generations that you teach in your classes? And then also, where are you learning these tools from? Who taught you? What thinkers taught you? And that are guiding this tool, the creation process of that, you know? Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
You want to start about what are the resources for thinking?
Okay. Yes, let me try. I'm quite... this bread metaphor is like trying hard to think with it. But I think, Ijoma, thinking about trying to understand the question well, because I think that if I understand, you're asking in the creation, if you're kind of thinking about like aesthetic histories or lineages or, for example, like ways of understanding oneself in relation to what's come before you, like kind of what are those, and those, of course, are like to such a large extent constructed, and that's why you're saying like how do you, if we're talking about constructing different ways, different mechanisms. So an example comes to mind of sort of the ways in which at present in museums as kind of the historical institutions that were pedagogical, but not just for, you know, but sort of to a wider mass. Like it had a public pedagogy and really citizenship development component to it. And I think that what is, you know, I mean, there's a lot that can be said about what's going on in museums and the language that's being used, kind of mostly around decolonizing spaces, projects of restitution. But I think that what's key to all of those like new methods of bread making in there is I think that there is a big question around to what extent is destruction necessary. You know, to what extent are the old cabinets and
machines,
and plinths and you know, to what extent must should we be asking, should they be taken out, should they be given back, and if they're given back, you know, then what do people want to do with them? If they want to put them in a pile and set them alight, you know, so I think there's a lot of that around what are the methodologies. So there's a lot of thinking that leads us to points of we need to dismantle things, and then I think that in the consequent remantling or recreation, it's really open-ended, and I think that there are strategies that I've come across where people, you know, for example, in some of the museums I've worked with, where there is genuine kind of work, for example, in Brazil, in peripheral urban areas where there are massive, a really beautiful art collection project that happened over many years that collected art made by sort of very ordinary people. As a very strong counterpoint to the idea of art collection as kind of always being underscored by value and capital value and so on. So, you know, there are interesting generative projects that are all over that one can find, but those are always, those seem to be very much in conversation with questions about destruction, breaking down so that we can rebuild.
One of the people, you asked about the people, but also the tools, to touch on the tools. I think everybody who reads decolonial work, some people don't quite like it. Aníbal Cuyano, right? But also that school, Enrique Dussel, Nelson, Maldonado Torres, Maria Lugones, and I can mention elsewhere, and then Sabelo from here now in Germany. So Aníbal Cuyano says something like, in spite of the fact that political colonialism has ended, right, which is also Sabelo said itself, so the relationship between European or Western culture and cultures in Latin America and Africa continue to be one of colonial domination, right? So we live in a colonial matrix, even right now. Alta Mignol as well says the same. But then he says something quite interesting. He says, well, this relationship is not an external one. It's an internal one. It's a colonization of the imagination, right? So here's a person who's just offered me the vocabulary. Okay, so... And Fanon, of course, says something more or less the same. But Fanon says a lot of other things. But this is one of them. Fanon is the second. I've just mentioned a few people. But I must say this again. So there are people who are writing, who are doing work, who are artists. A few years back, I watched Jeleli, the performer. I get the surname from Nigeria, performing in the middle of Paris. I thought, wow, that's fantastic. But also about something not African, environmentalism, when people were not in that mode already. So, whoa, amazing. Take photographs, take videos. I like that you come with this, when people even not think about you. So I'm going to perform in the middle of Paris, Sorbonne, about environmentalism. So the people who are performing, who are writing, and bell hooks for somebody who is because bell hooks are writing so much, helped me a lot to think about masculinities, right? Of course, 3-4 books around that. Bell hooks is great about love as well, about how love works. So, and then the questions from people who are not writing, so who might not be writing, either they're students. So that's the ingredients, the people who are bringing. But this idea of resources, do you think, and I'm not really asking you about this because I sit with this question, would you, if you were in a position like a professor of political science, sociology, or psychology, move to have an African psychology sub-department or department? It's a way of destroying, right? It's a way of saying, look, this is not working for us. So some people have been saying this, we must create departments. So it's a refusal then, like, okay, this conversation is not working out. So we're going to, as it were, not destroy so much, just start our own thing. Would you do that at Stellenbosch? Would you work and agitate to do that work? So, because it's been done before, right? African politics came out of that. African history came out of that. African philosophy, departments in the US mostly, maybe some European countries. Would you do that if your subject allows you to do that? Your subject, because it's just a refusal. This is not working. We're going to start something that just offers us freedom to do what we want. I don't have a conclusive answer. In one moment, I'm thinking it's a strategic way to do this, but in another way, I don't want to give up this thing called psychology globally. I don't want to give it up to European, because Euro-American psychology is Euro-American psychology, but it goes under the name of psychology. Right? That's the point. So you don't want to give it up. You want to do something with it rather than completely destroying the bakery, as it were. You want to say, well, I'm going to make new bread right now, different bread. But by the way, if the question I assume that you are saying is it depends who you're talking to, right? Instead, if you're at Fort Hare, it's a different conversation. If you're at Stellenbosch, of course, it's because your interlocutors are different. They don't understand this. So this is where you do. In Fort Hare, it seems you might have more opportunity to say, well, we're going to just do it in the same, as it were, bakery. We're just going to do this. And there might be more resources, might be, not always, but might be. Please.
Okay, I'll be short because a lot of the questions that I had was actually answered in this session. So thank you so much for inviting us into this conversation. It's been so incredibly interesting. I think the thing that stood out for me for this conversation is how you both are grappling with these categories, both negotiating with it and denouncing it at the same time, which makes it so slippery and so difficult to adopt fully. So I would, in carrying on this conversation surrounding situatedness, so seeing as we have to think from this place called Stellenbosch, and you mentioned Mbekiism. I've never thought of I'm an African as Mbekiism, but okay, going with that, and having it all. What do we then do with the Sonke Gender displays in the museum?
Nice.
Yeah. What do we do with that?
Or the museum.
Or the museum
itself.
With the museum, with the building's legacy, the building's legacy, the building's legacy and its history, because the museum itself can be used as a microcosmic example of Stellenbosch itself, where, for instance, these pods of knowledges, like for instance, Sonke Gender being started in 1926 at this very university, and now we're sitting with the repercussions and the remnant thereof, and we have to encounter that in a museum on a daily basis. So what if we were to adopt Mbekiism, and I'm not saying that's what you were doing, but the idea of having it all, what would we do with that?
What do we do with the museum?
So,
and its content.
The content. But what would we do with that museum?
I really like the question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question because it's maybe the problem with trying to have it all is that you can land up with nothing, you know, that, and I think that I was thinking about this in part of my doctoral research. I wrote about the Rio Museum that burnt down in 2018 or something. And what was really fascinating about that is that it's a museum that would be quite familiar to us, you know, in the global south, sort of very much in the Western model, but like a dustier, mustier version with all sorts of dilapidated things in it, and frankly all sorts of racist displays, you know, that people are like so put off by that they don't visit it. So like many museums in the global south, it was, you know, under-visited, under-loved, all of these things. Then it burnt down. And it was not only the proponents of, you know, those who still thought that those sort of racist, racializing frameworks were, that those invested in those frameworks, but those outside of those frameworks also said, but our things have now burnt. You know, the people from indigenous communities said this is a huge loss because we never got the chance to rethink them, to take them out of those cases, to talk about what they meant, and you know. So I think that's the difficult thing, is that if you sort of try to have it all, there's such a high chance of things just staying as they are. And if you try one particular or another particular mechanism to say maybe let's take away this, or let's invite these people, or let's take some of these things and give them to these people and see what happens, and then put, you know, document that and put that back in the museum. That's the sort of thing I think people are experimenting with, because I think if you just sort of have a very expansive, this is all, everything is our history, we can't touch it because it's our history. You know, we can't actually tamper with it because we're tampering with history. We can't destroy it, we can't, then nothing will change at all.
But you have offered a different answer, which is, and the word is contextualization. It's always contextualization, which is really situating yourself. So the museum, this museum, needs to do what this learning some of us are doing. It has to do a great deal of contextualization. So all the work has to be put in that context, including that other people, you know, a line like that. Other people don't like this, but here's a part of it, and here's another part. But also bring, I am okay now, more and more, to put Jackson Hlongwani's mystical stuff and the art I put it together in the one room. Like, this is all part of every. The sometimes the trouble is to use what you would say, to re-tribalize the African, right? Only to re-tribalize, or even the the major impulse is to say we're only township, we're only tribal, we're only Bantu, we're only African in this restricted sense, only black. But no, actually, black people have always moved, have always been changing, have recreated an entirely, or at least a majorly new culture, a new nation. Black Americans have changed the culture of being black in the world. I mean, they even offer it to the world, like, hey, you can also be a rap star in Japan. Like, whoa, this is amazing. So you can do that. You can be global, of course, while you're holding, as you know, the history of African American art. And at the same time, of course, you create the Museum of African American History and Culture, which is a beautiful building. I mean, it's like an amazing, created by, now David Ajayi, who's a little dodgy, but that's a different debate altogether. Okay. Please, yes?
Thank you.
I think that's the last question we might have, yes.
Hopefully it'll be a short one. But I wonder about teaching art and creativity in a place like this, and how teaching here actually feels like your expressive potential is limited because of the delay in conversations in the town with students amongst themselves. And what does it look like to teach making, teach engagement, teach awareness, for lack of a better word. Not that I think that one can really teach those things, but in a place like this, in a town like this, particularly because it's behind the conversations, it feels like we were talking about just a little bit of a delay. Should we hold back on using these terms or this term? Whereas sometimes it feels like the rest of the world, the rest of this country is kind of getting on with it, right? And here we're still negotiating very different things, which are valuable, of course, but in terms of creativity and making art, how does one negotiate that?
So we'll be having a different conversation at VETS, for instance.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's not so great for our university to say that. But please go ahead, about making in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, and I think that because sort of theorizing and finding the language, and that's one thing entirely, but making is something different. And I was thinking about something similar just very recently, thinking about AVRIC does a project with the visual arts department, and I was sort of dreaming and speculating a little bit about breaking some of the rules about what can go up on campus, like what you can post where and what you... And so in a sense, that sort of just comes to mind in the sense that if one would imagine, it feels to me like the rules and the, all of the structures that keep things behind. Where behind even from Cape Town, which is behind from, that you'd say these conversations have already happened. For example, at Iziko, they're like, no, we shouldn't be talking about African art. We should just be talking about art. Like, we're in Africa. I mean, why must we say African art in South Africa? But, so then what... So I don't know, because it's a very... But the only thing that comes to mind is sort of... a sense of leaning into that disruption, and leaning into the making and being creative as a form, as a language against this very silencing, quiet bylines policies that, no one sees but everyone feels. And maybe that is where, you're not theorizing anymore, finding language, but you're speaking a visual language. And it would be beautiful if that would be unleashed in a place like this.
So the question is great, but I somewhat say, of course you can teach awareness. Otherwise I will not be a teacher. Then I have already failed before I start. You can teach engagement, even making, I suppose. That this is precisely where the psychologists, if they are already aware that the changing of consciousness is as important as other things. So the changing of awareness is where I suppose I am located, the changing consciousness, which would then lead to different kinds of making. But yes, the university that we call ours, it seems to be delayed in some respects.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more, you can check out our website.